A retired black nurse revived a celebrity. On a flight, but his secret reward left her speechless. She didn't recognize the man collapsing 2 rows ahead, not until after she'd saved his life. She was just a retired nurse, seated in 14C, flying coach like everyone else. But when his pulse stopped, she didn't hesitate. She acted. And when she found out who he was, the ripple effect uncovered a 50-year-old lie, buried in hospital records and whispered behind boardroom doors. Who was Marcia Bell, the nurse erased from history? Why did a dying man leave behind a confession that changed everything? And how did one quiet woman's truth spark a national reckoning inside the American medical system? This isn't just a story about saving a life. It's about reclaiming one. And it all started at 35,000 feet. Before we dive into this powerful, true-to-life tale of justice, memory, and the quiet power of truth, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Turn on notifications so you don't miss a single story that stirs the soul and challenges the world. Now, let's begin. Clara Monroe had never liked flying. Not because she feared turbulence or heights. No, it was something else. Something about the recycled air, the mechanical stillness of people packed together, yet each trapped in private silence. It reminded her of the hospital, of sterile waiting rooms, of nights spent pacing under fluorescent lights, hoping someone's heart would restart in time. The plane hummed steadily as it cut across the sky somewhere above Colorado. Clara sat in 22C, a window seat, her eyes half closed as she sipped lukewarm tea. She had dressed neatly for the flight Navy cardigan, pressed slacks, hair wrapped in a patterned scarf, always put together. That's what her late husband had liked. That's what she'd kept doing long after he was gone. She wasn't going to Atlanta for pleasure. No, this trip had weight to it. She hadn't set foot in Georgia in over 30 years, not since that day in 1973. And yet here she was, 64 years old, a widow, a retired nurse with a quiet past and a locked box of secrets she had never planned to revisit. Until last week. She sighed and looked out the window. Endless clouds, the occasional shimmer of sunlight cutting across their tops. Peaceful, for now. Then the commotion started. It began with the sound of a tray clattering to the floor in first class. A sharp gasp, a voice rising too quickly. Sir, are you all right?" Clara turned her head. A flight attendant stood frozen in the aisle near row 2. Her voice trembled, trying to stay calm but cracking around the edges. Passengers in the front rows were already shifting, heads turning, phones pulled out. A tall man, was slumped over in his seat, body convulsing in sharp, jerking spasms. His hand banged against the seat divider, knuckles whitening. His head rolled back. That's when Clara saw the face. And her breath caught, Grayson Locke. Even in crisis, he was unmistakable. The jawline, the gray at his temples, the kind of face you didn't forget, especially if you'd once seen it on magazine covers at checkout aisles for over a decade. He was a celebrity, an actor, a humanitarian, too, according to TV interviews. But now, he was just a man, seasoned violently 35,000 feet in the air. The flight attendant's voice cut through the rising panic. "Is there a doctor on board?" Clara didn't move at first. Old instincts rose inside her like a muscle memory she'd tried to bury. But something else held her back. She hadn't practiced in years. What if she failed? What if this was God testing her? Again. Another cry. Please, is there a doctor or a nurse?" Her hands moved before her thoughts caught up. She stood, handed her tea to the man beside her, and stepped into the aisle. "I'm a retired nurse," she said firmly, her voice louder than she remembered it being in years. "Let me through." People parted like water. Clara walked steadily, heart thudding but hands calm. She knelt beside Grayson Locke just as his body jerked again. Foam pooled at the corner of his mouth. His watch, a sleek, silver thing, flashed under the overhead lights as his arm spasmed. She scanned quickly, shallow breathing, cyanosis around the lips. This was a seizure, tonic-clonic phase, likely less than a minute in. She turned to the attendant. "How long has he been like this?" "Less than a minute," the woman stammered. He was fine. Then he just started, "Get the medical kit." "Now." Clara eased Grayson onto his side, careful to keep his airway clear. She placed her sweater under his head, noting the clammy skin, the tremors still rolling through him like distant thunder. He was going to come out of it. But the bigger question lingered. Why had it happened? She felt his pulse rapid but strong. No sign of trauma. Passengers stared, murmuring behind cupped hands. Clara blocked them out. "Sir," she said gently. "Grayson, can you hear me?" His eyelids fluttered, lips parted. He groaned something unintelligible, then whispered again, hoarse and broken. "Everett." The name stabbed through her like ice. Clara's spine stiffened. She hadn't heard that name in decades. Not since no. It couldn't be. She must have misheard. But then he said it again, eyes still unfocused. "Everett. Dad." Clara's throat tightened. The flight attendant returned, medical kit in hand, face pale. "We should alert the captain," she whispered. Clara nodded slowly, still kneeling beside the man. "Yes, and tell him we'll need paramedics waiting in Atlanta." She glanced back at Grayson, whose breathing had stabilized but whose face still bore traces of something deeper than a seizure. That name, that face, that family. She hadn't come here for this. But maybe the past had followed her anyway. The hum of the plane returned to her ears as if from a great distance. Clara took a deep breath and reached for the oxygen mask in the kit, slipping it gently over Grayson's face. "You're going to be okay," she whispered, more to herself than to him. But, even as she said it, she wasn't sure it was true. Grayson Locke was breathing steadily now. His body had stopped trembling. The convulsions faded into a heavy, breathless stillness. His head rested gently on Clara's folded sweater, and the overhead lights buzzed softly above them, sterile and indifferent, as if nothing had happened at all. The flight attendant crouched nearby, still visibly shaken. "He's stable," Clara murmured, her fingers resting lightly at his wrist. "But keep a close watch on his vitals. We need to make sure he doesn't lapse again." The woman nodded. "I radioed the cockpit. EMTs will be waiting when we land." Clara gave a single nod and looked back at the man lying before her. Grayson Locke, a name with weight, a name that had once been spoken in whispers across Hollywood dinner tables, flashed across screens, etched onto gold statuettes. But now he looked nothing like the man in glossy magazines. No stylus, no lighting, no curated smile, just a man, pale and vulnerable, body betraying him 35,000 feet in the air. Clara studied his face carefully. His eyes were closed. A faint frown still lingered across his forehead, like his muscles hadn't quite caught up with the silence. There were tiny tremors in his fingers, but his breathing had evened out. His chest rose and fell in quiet rhythm. Her hands, trained from decades in emergency rooms, recognized the subtle signs of postictal fatigue. But it wasn't just her hands that remembered, it was her entire body. Her knees ached from crouching too long. Her throat was tight. Not from exertion, but from the memory of a name that had cut through the cabin like a razor. Everett. She hadn't heard that name aloud in almost 4 decades. And yet, it came from this man's mouth, broken and trembling. Her pulse hadn't returned to normal since the moment she had recognized that name. It was like a thread pulled from a forgotten sweater, unraveling every careful stitch she had woven to keep the past buried. For 40 years, Clara had avoided the locks, both the name and the legacy, but now, one of them had landed at her feet, quite literally, unconscious and unaware of the quiet storm he had just unleashed in her. The curtain dividing business class from first class was still half drawn. A few curious eyes peeked through. The rest of the passengers had quieted. The murmuring had faded. No more gasps, no more camera phones held high, just the hum of jet engines and the quiet strain of a woman trying to steady her breathing. Clara stood slowly, pressing her hand against her lower back. "Let's move him," she said quietly. "He'll need privacy when he comes to." The flight attendant nodded again, grateful to defer to someone who seemed so in control. "There's a fold-down bed in the crew rest area. I'll get someone to help us." Together with another crew member, they lifted Grayson gently and guided him into the narrow galley at the back. Then up the small steps into the cabin's rest space where the lights were dim and the air felt just slightly warmer. Clara sat beside him as he slept. She didn't have to. Her part was done. She had stabilized him, issued the report, passed the baton. Any other retired woman would have returned to her seat and let the airline staff handle the rest. But she stayed. Not because he was famous, not even because he'd said the name. She stayed because something deeper had begun to stir in her. Something she had not felt in a long time. The sharp pulse of unfinished business. His eyelids fluttered. A groan escaped his lips. She leaned forward slightly. "You're okay," she whispered. "You had a seizure, but you're okay." His eyes opened slowly, unfocused. "Where?" His voice was dry, frayed. "Where am I?" "You're still on the plane," she said calmly. "We're about 45 minutes out from Atlanta." He blinked, the fog in his gaze slowly lifting. Clara noticed the panic start to rise behind his eyes, and she raised a hand gently. "You're safe. I'm Clara. I'm a retired nurse. You had a seizure," I responded. His chest rose sharply. "A seizure." She nodded. "I don't." He paused. "I don't usually get those. Not like that. You ever had one before? Not since I was a teenager." He swallowed. His hand instinctively reached for his chest, then his head. "Sometimes," he said slowly. "They come when I'm under too much pressure. I haven't slept much, or eaten." Clara didn't push further. She knew how people with power like to downplay their own fragility, especially men, especially public ones. But then he looked at her, really looked at her, as if something familiar echoed in her face. "I know you," he said softly. "No," she replied quickly. "You don't." But he kept staring. "I've seen you somewhere." Clara gave a faint smile. "I've got one of those faces." "No," he said again, this time more certain. "I've seen your photo. My dad had photos. From back in Chicago, old nurses, from Memorial Hospital." Her blood went cold. She turned away, lips pressed tight. "Everett," he said. "You knew Everett Locke." She closed her eyes. There it was again. That name. "I did," she said quietly, "a long time ago." He watched her for a long moment, as if waiting for her to elaborate. But she didn't. Instead, Clara stood and straightened the blanket that had slipped down his legs. "You should rest." Grayson frowned slightly, still caught between awareness and confusion. Did he do something he asked? "To you?" Her eyes snapped back to his, and for a brief moment, Clara saw something she hadn't expected in his face. Not arrogance, not entitlement, but guilt. Guilt not earned, but inherited. Clara's throat tightened. She could have said 100 things in that moment. Could have told him about the incident report, about the woman who had died under his father's scalpel, about the way the hospital covered it all up, about the look in Everett Locke's eyes when he walked out of that OR as if nothing had happened. But she didn't. Not yet. Instead, she sat back down, folding her hands in her lap. "I knew your father," she said softly, "but we'll talk about that when you're stronger." He nodded slowly, didn't push, and that, in itself, made her soften just slightly. Outside, the sky had begun to shift. The sun dipped behind a curtain of clouds, casting a golden hue across the windows. The announcement crackled through the speaker's descent beginning. Seat belts, final trash collection. Clara looked at the man beside her. Grayson Locke. A stranger, yet somehow not. A spark from a buried matchstick. Maybe this trip to Atlanta wasn't a coincidence after all. The plane had begun its descent into Atlanta. Outside, the clouds hung low like gray silk. The seatbelt signs chimed on overhead, and the flight attendants moved methodically through the cabin, checking tray tables and upright chairs, though their eyes occasionally flicked toward the crew rest compartment where Clara still sat beside Grayson. He was sleeping again, not deeply, not peacefully, but enough to steady his heartbeat. Clara leaned back slightly, her spine resting against the bulkhead wall. Her fingers were folded in her lap, but her thoughts had already left the aircraft. They were far, far away, 4 decades away. In fact, back in Chicago, back in that hallway, back in that operating room, 1973. She could still smell the antiseptic in the air, hear the distant shuffle of rubber soles on tile, hear the voice of Marcia Bell, her mentor, her sister in everything but blood, calling out, "Clara, where's the chart for room 412? Clara was 23 then, fresh-faced, soft-spoken, eager to prove herself. Marcia, in contrast, was all confidence, bold, sharp, the kind of woman who held her chin high even when hospital policy tried to shove her back down. She wore her nurse's badge like armor and her afro like a crown, and she'd taken Clara under her wing the way older sisters are supposed to. They were the only 2 black women in the surgical ward that year. There had been whispers, of course, comments that floated behind their backs like cigarette smoke. The male residents rarely looked them in the eye. Some surgeons forgot to acknowledge their presence in pre-op meetings, but Marcia wouldn't let any of that get to her. "We're here to save lives," she used to say, not stroke egos. Clara had admired her for that. But admiration turned into guilt the day Marcia walked into OR 3 for a routine appendectomy and never walked back out. Clara hadn't been assigned to that surgery. She'd been preparing supplies for another case down the hall. But she remembered the shift in the hallway, how nurses stopped moving. how a code was called and no one told her what it meant until it was already too late. By the time Clara reached the observation window, Marcia was already flat on the table. The surgeon in charge had been a young doctor, just a few years older than Clara, white, polished, carried himself like he was born in the O.R. His name had been Everett Locke. He hadn't even looked shaken when he walked out of the operating room. She coded during closure. He told the supervisor calmly, complications, blood pressure dropped too fast, nothing we could do. But Clara had seen the look in the scrub nurse's eyes, the fear, the disbelief, later that evening. Clara cornered the nurse in the staff locker room. They spoke in hushed tones. What she heard made her blood run cold. He nicked an artery. The nurse whispered. He didn't even realize it until the bleeding was too much. He panicked. Did he call for help? No. He told us to stay quiet, said he had it under control, and when she coded, he froze. Clara had filed a report the next morning. She hadn't wanted revenge. She just wanted someone to ask questions, but no one ever followed up. Weeks passed, then months. One day, her report vanished from the system. No warning, no explanation. Everett Locke went on to publish papers, rose quickly through the ranks. He was head of cardiothoracic surgery by the time Clara left the hospital, and Marcia Bell reduced to a footnote. Complication during routine surgery. Clara had carried the weight of that silence for 40 years. And now here she was, sharing cramped cabin air with the man's son, Grayson Locke, a man who, even unconscious, had managed to speak the name that haunted her most. She glanced at him now, his chest gently rising beneath the airline blanket. What had made him say that name? What did he know? She stood up slowly and moved back toward the galley. The flight attendants were seated for landing, belted in and whispering to one another. As Clara passed, the younger of the two reached out gently. "You were incredible back there," she said. "You kept everyone calm." Clara offered a thin smile. "Old habits. You're not just any nurse, are you?" Clara paused. "I used to be," she said, "a long time ago." The plane tilted slightly. The skyline of Atlanta stretched into view beyond the window. Lights blinking on in the twilight, buildings clustered like secrets waiting to be revealed. She returned to her seat in 22C. From here, the plane felt cold again, distant, detached. Clara glanced down at her hands, still steady, still capable, but she could feel the tremble under the skin, the kind that doesn't show but aches somewhere deep in the bones. When the wheels hit the runway, the thud felt heavier than usual. The captain's voice came over the intercom. Routine instructions. "Thank you for flying. Use caution when opening the overhead bins." All the usual words. But Clara wasn't listening. She kept thinking about Marcia, about the look in her eyes that last week, about the joke she'd made, half laughing, half serious. "If anything ever happens to me in that O.R., make sure someone asks questions. Clara." She had laughed then. She wasn't laughing now. The doors opened with a hiss. Passengers began standing, stretching, fumbling for their bags, the usual post-flight chaos. But Clara stayed seated, watching as paramedics boarded with quick, purposeful steps. They wheeled a stretcher toward the crew rest space. She followed them, quietly, and gave her name to the EMT, gave a brief report, vital signs, duration. Response to oxygen. The lead paramedic nodded with professional respect. Thank you, Ms. Monroe. You probably saved his life." Clara didn't respond. Grayson was awake now, sitting up, legs dangling off the cot. He looked at her with something between curiosity and gratitude. "I meant what I said," he whispered. "I've seen your picture in my father's files." Clara's voice was steady. "Then you should ask him why he kept it." His eyes flickered. She turned away. As the stretcher was rolled down the jet bridge, Clara stepped aside and watched from the shadows. The air in the terminal felt thick, warmer than she remembered. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. A text from Andre. "Landed early. Already at the gate. You okay?" She stared at it for a moment, then typed back, "I need to tell you something. Meet me outside baggage claim. Alone." Her thumb hovered, then hit send. She exhaled and stepped into the terminal. Atlanta. After all these years. The city hadn't changed much, but Clara had. And something told her this flight was only the beginning. The rain had just begun when Clara stepped outside the terminal. It was the soft, misty kind of rain, barely more than a whisper against the pavement. Atlanta's air felt thick with memory, like the city hadn't forgotten her after all this time. She stood for a moment beneath the covered walkway, watching travelers move in every direction, tugging suitcases, scanning phones, speaking in hurried tones. And then she saw him. Andre stood by the black sedan, his pilot's uniform crisp despite the humidity, his hat tucked under his arm. He spotted her before she called out, and his face broke into that same quiet, warm smile he'd had since boyhood. He opened the passenger door as she approached, his eyes searching hers. "Mom," he said softly. "You okay?" Clara nodded but didn't speak. She slipped into the seat, felt the coolness of the leather against her back. Andre slid in beside her, started the engine, then glanced sideways as he pulled out from the curb. "You didn't respond much after the landing," he said, "and your text sounded serious." She looked out the window, watching droplets race each other down the glass. "I need to tell you something," she said. His hands tightened slightly on the wheel, but he said nothing. They drove in silence for a few miles, the GPS softly offering directions to nowhere in particular. Clara finally asked him to pull into a quiet side street near Grant Park, under a cluster of dogwood trees. The rain ticked gently on the windshield. "Do you remember," she began, her voice low, "when you were in high school and you asked me why I never worked at the hospital again after we moved?" Andre turned the ignition off. The sudden silence made her words sharper. "I remember," he said. "You said it was complicated." It was. She took a breath, folded her hands in her lap. "But it's time you heard the full truth." Andre didn't move. He just listened, the way her husband used to. Patient. Steady. "In 1973, I was a surgical nurse in Chicago," she said, "at Memorial. It was my 3rd year in the ward. That year, I worked alongside a woman named Marcia Bell." Andre's brow furrowed. "That name sounds familiar," Clara continued, her voice steady now. "She was everything. Brave, outspoken, talented. She had more experience than most of the residents, and she taught me how to stand tall in rooms where people didn't want us." There was a beat of silence before she added, "She died on the table during a routine appendectomy. The surgeon made a mistake. He nicked an artery, panicked, froze." Andre inhaled sharply. "Was it reported I filed it?" Clara said. "I wrote the incident report myself, but it vanished, disappeared from the records. and the surgeon went on to win awards, publish books. His name was Everett Locke. Andre blinked. Wait, Locke. As in, she nodded. The man I'd just saved on the plane was his son, Grayson Locke. Andre leaned back in his seat, processing. You're telling me the man in first class is the child of the man who buried Marcia Bell's death under hospital politics. A long silence stretched between them. Clara watched as her son stared at the dashboard, his jaw clenched. And you've carried that all this time. I tried to let it go. I tried to move forward, but I couldn't forget Marcia's voice, or the way no one ever said her name again. Andre finally looked at her. Why didn't you tell me? Before Clara shook her head, her voice trembling. Because I didn't want your memories of me to be burdened by something I couldn't fix. I didn't want you growing up thinking the world was too cruel to challenge. But maybe I was wrong to stay silent. Maybe silence is its own kind of betrayal. Andre reached across the console, took her hand. You didn't betray anyone. Mom, you survived. You protected me. That wasn't weakness. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes. She hadn't realized how much she needed to hear that, how deeply the silence had settled into her bones after all these years. I don't know what Grayson knows, she whispered, but he said something strange while he was seizing. He called out for Everett, not just Dad. He said his name, like it was unresolved, like something in him was trying to reach through the fog. Andre exhaled. Maybe it's time for the past to come out. Clara hesitated. There's more. Andre waited. Your father left behind a safety deposit key. I never opened the box. I didn't know what it was for. But yesterday, before I flew out, I did. She pulled a small envelope from her purse and handed it to him. Inside was a faded photograph of 3 nurses in white uniforms. Marcia stood in the center, radiant and proud. Clara was beside her, smiling nervously, and behind them, slightly out of frame, stood a young doctor, his face only half visible. The back of the photo had handwriting. Marcia Bell, Clara Monroe, April 3rd, 1973, the day everything changed. Andre stared at it. Clara continued. There was also a document, a copy of my original incident report. Your father must have found a way to preserve it. Maybe he always hoped I'd tell the truth when I was ready. Andre closed the envelope gently. What are you going to do? He asked. Clara looked out the window again. The rain had eased, and patches of light were beginning to break through the clouds. I don't know, she said. Grayson invited me to speak with his father. I said no, but maybe it's time. Andre nodded slowly. If you go, I'm going with you. She smiled faintly. I knew you'd say that. They sat in silence for another long moment. The weight between them finally aired out into something like shared understanding. The quiet no longer felt so heavy. Then Clara's phone buzzed. Unknown number. She hesitated, then answered. Ms. Monroe, a woman's voice said, calm and professional. Yes, my name is Naomi Bell Wright. I believe you knew my mother, Marcia Bell. Clara froze. I've been looking for you, Naomi continued. My father told me about a nurse named Clara who tried to stand up for my mother after her death. I couldn't find any records. But then I got a call from Grayson Locke. Clara's heart pounded. I think, Naomi said, it's time we talked. They agreed to meet in a small cafe tucked into the corner of an old red brick building in downtown Atlanta. It wasn't grand or flashy. It smelled like cinnamon and coffee grounds, and the walls were lined with bookshelves. Rain tapped softly at the windows as Clara stepped inside, pulling the hood of her coat back and letting her eyes adjust to the warm light. The place was quiet, save for the low jazz music and the occasional clink of ceramic cups. She spotted Naomi Bell Wright instantly, a woman in her early 50s, dressed simply in dark jeans and a slate gray blazer. Her natural hair was pulled back in a low puff. A briefcase sat beside her, unopened. She wasn't sipping anything, just tracing the rim of her untouched mug with the tip of her finger. Their eyes met. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Naomi stood. "Ms. Monroe." Clara nodded. "Please, just Clara." They shook hands. Naomi's grip was firm, not aggressive, just certain, like someone who had spent a lifetime walking into rooms where she wasn't expected and making sure she stayed there. They sat. Clara folded her hands in her lap, unsure how to begin. Naomi beat her to it. "Thank you for agreeing to meet me," she said softly. "I've searched for you for a long time. I didn't know anyone was looking." Clara replied. Naomi offered a small smile. "Most people don't. That's why I keep looking." There was a pause. "I don't know how much you remember." Clara began carefully, "But your mother was everything to me." Naomi's expression didn't waver. "She talked about you often. I was only a child when she passed, but I remember things. Her voice, her hands, how she always came home tired, but still found time to braid my hair. She made up songs about the hospital when she cooked. She used to hum to herself when she thought I wasn't listening." Clara swallowed the lump in her throat. "That sounds like her. After she died, my father tried to get answers, but the hospital gave him nothing. Said it was a complication. Said they did everything they could. Then he got sick, and by the time I was old enough to understand what happened, the records were already buried." Clara reached slowly into her purse and pulled out the worn envelope. Inside was a faded photo and a copy of the incident report she'd written by hand in 1973. She slid it across the table. Naomi picked it up, hands trembling ever so slightly. The air between them thickened. As Naomi read, her eyes slowly widened. She reached the last paragraph, and her lips parted, but no sound came. Then, finally, she looked up. "You tried," she whispered. "I was too late." Clara replied. "No, you tried. You put your name on this. You put it in writing." Clara felt her chest tighten. "I was 23. I thought someone would see it and act. Instead, it vanished, just like she did." Naomi set the paper down carefully. "My whole life. I've lived in the shadow of a mystery no one would explain. All I had was anger, until now." They sat quietly for a moment, two women linked by pain neither had chosen. Then Naomi said, "Do you know what Grayson Locke said when he called me?" Clara looked up. He said, "I think my father did something, and I think my life was built on someone else's silence." Clara blinked. He said that Naomi nodded. "He's not like his father, at least not in the ways that matter. He told me you saved his life, and that you knew something about his past that might finally explain the unease he's carried for years." Clara let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "I don't want revenge," she said. Naomi leaned forward. "Neither do I, but I want the truth, and I want my mother's name to mean something more than a hospital statistic. I understand." There was another pause. Then Naomi asked, carefully, Would you testify if this goes public?" Clara's eyes dropped to the table. Her fingers toyed with the edge of her napkin. "I haven't spoken about it in 40 years, she said. "Not even to my son. Until yesterday. And now," Clara raised her gaze. "Now, I think the silence has done more harm than the truth ever could." Naomi nodded, her eyes misting. "There's going to be backlash. The media, the hospital board. He's still revered in some circles. I know. Are you ready for that?" Clara's voice didn't waver. "No, but I'm going anyway." A silence settled over them this time, not heavy, but sacred. Clara reached for her coat. Naomi did the same. As they stood, Naomi looked at her again. "My mother would have loved you," she said. Clara smiled through the ache in her chest. "I hope she knows I didn't forget her. She knows." They walked out together into the gray of early evening. The rain had stopped, but the street still shimmered with its memory. Clara paused before parting ways. "I'm going to meet with Everett Locke," she said quietly. Naomi's eyebrows lifted. "What for?" Clara looked out at the city skyline. "Not for closure," she said. "For accountability." Naomi nodded slowly. "Then I'll stand with you." They parted with a quiet promise. And as Clara walked down the block, she felt lighter. Not because the weight had lifted, but because she was finally sharing it. And for the first time in decades, she wasn't alone. The bank was quiet that morning. It sat at the corner of a sleepy block just outside downtown Decatur, surrounded by old pecan trees and faded storefronts. Clara had passed this building 100 times without thinking. But today, as she stood at the reception desk with Andre beside her, everything about it felt heavier. Her fingers gripped the small brass key in her coat pocket. It had belonged to James. He had never explained why he'd kept it, just handed it to her one night after dinner. Back in 1993, when Andre was still in college and the world felt like it might start making sense. "If you ever need the truth," he'd said, "this key will help." She hadn't asked for details. She hadn't been ready to know. But now, 3 decades later, she stood with her son and felt the metal warm in her hand. The bank manager, a short man with gentle eyes and graying temples, led them through a back hallway and into the vault room. Everything smelled like paper and steel. Clara handed him the key. He fitted it into the box and clicked it open. "Take your time," he said politely, then stepped out, closing the heavy door behind him. The box wasn't large, just about the size of a small suitcase. Inside, resting carefully on yellowed felt, were 4 objects: a leather-bound notebook, a manila envelope sealed with red wax, a cassette tape in a clear plastic case, and a photograph curled at the edges. Clara reached for the photo first. It was black and white. Marcia Bell stood in the middle, smiling. To her left, a younger Clara, nervous, bright-eyed, and on the right, James Monroe, dressed in hospital scrubs, one hand resting lightly on Marcia's shoulder. "I forgot he was even in that room," Clara whispered. Andre leaned in. He worked with her. He rotated through her floor sometimes, but he never told me they were that close. She turned the photo over. In James's slanted handwriting were the words, "This is what they erased. Never forget who she was." Clara felt her throat close. Next, she lifted the envelope. The wax cracked under her thumb as she peeled it open. Inside were 6 pages typewritten, stamped with a letterhead from the Internal Affairs Division of the Chicago Medical Review Board. Each page documented testimony, not from her, not from the scrub nurse, but from a surgical tech named Harold Lindley. "I remember him," Clara said. "Quiet. He always brought his lunch in a brown paper bag." Andre scanned the first lines. He says Everett Locke delayed calling the code, that he refused to let others take over, that blood pooled for 3 minutes before anyone responded. Clara closed her eyes. She could see it now how that moment had played out. Not just medical negligence, but ego, silence, power wielded like a scalpel. She reached next for the cassette tape. Andre turned it over in his hand. Dad must have recorded something. Clara nodded slowly. He had one of those handheld recorders, always carried it during case reviews. He said memory can be bought, but voice is permanent. Back at Andre's apartment, they played it on an old tape player he kept for nostalgic purposes. The voice that came through was unmistakable. It was James Monroe, tired, controlled, steady. "This is James Monroe. I'm recording this on June 3rd of 1989. If you're hearing this, it means I've either passed or the truth matters more than the risk. I'm leaving behind evidence regarding the death of Nurse Marcia Bell at Chicago Memorial in 1973. What happened to her was preventable. It was covered up. The attending surgeon was Everett Locke. I was there that morning. I heard the panic in the OR. I saw the delay. I reviewed the vitals. I saw the deleted logs. Someone removed the alerts from the system to protect him. I tried to fight it, but the board warned me, told me I'd never work again if I pushed. So I didn't. I'm sorry. I was young and afraid, but I'm not afraid anymore." The tape clicked softly. Clara's hands covered her mouth. For a long time, neither she nor Andre spoke. When she finally looked at her son, his eyes were glassy. He carried that for decades. Andre whispered. He preserved everything. Clara nodded, tears slipping silently down her cheek, and he trusted me to finish it. They sat for a long time with the items laid out before them. The tape, the testimony, the photograph, all of it pieces of a story that had been erased, rewritten, and hidden in shadows. Andre reached into a drawer and pulled out his laptop. "I'm going to scan everything," he said quietly. "We make digital backups. We protect this story." Clara nodded again. "What now?" he asked. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she turned the photograph over again, staring at Marcia's face. Then she whispered, "We give her a name again, in public, loud enough for everyone to hear." Later that evening, Clara made a call. Grayson Locke answered after 2 rings. "Ms. Monroe," he said, voice low. "I've been thinking about you. I need to speak with your father." She said, "In person. No press, no lawyers." There was a pause. Then, "He's not well, but I'll arrange it. Thank you." "One more thing," Grayson added. "I found something in his old files. A letter addressed to C.M. I think it was for you." Clara's heart skipped. "I'll bring it," he said. They set the meeting for Friday, at a private home near the edge of the city. Neutral ground, safe, controlled. As Clara ended the call, Andre placed the sealed evidence in a small fireproof box and set it on the table between them. "Do you think people will believe you?" he asked. Clara looked up at him. "I don't know," she said softly, "but I'm not doing this to be believed." Then why she smiled gently. "So Marcia can rest." The Locke estate sat behind a high stone wall in Buckhead, quiet and draped in southern ivy. It wasn't the kind of place you stumbled upon. The driveway curled like a question mark through a manicured lawn, and the house itself loomed ahead elegant, cold, and distant, like a museum that had forgotten how to feel lived in. Clara's palms were damp. She sat beside Andre in the car, watching the front door from behind the windshield. The house felt like a relic of another era, one where men like Everett Locke were kings, and women like Marcia Bell were spoken of only in past tense, if at all. "You sure?" Andre asked softly. Clara nodded. "I've carried silence longer than anyone ever asked me to. It's time to lay it down." They got out together. Grayson met them at the door. He looked different than he had on the plane, less guarded, more tired. Like something inside him had cracked open and was still bleeding slowly. He opened the door without a word and led them through a long hallway lined with framed medical degrees and fading photographs, doctors shaking hands, hospital galas. Grayson, at 5 or 6, beaming beside his father, who looked exactly as Clara remembered, tall, confident, untouchable. They reached a room at the back of the house, a sunroom, with soft light filtering through gauzy curtains. A fireplace flickered low on one wall. In a high-backed chair near the window sat Everett Locke. He was older now, thinner. His hair was gray, hands slightly trembling on the arms of the chair, but there was no mistaking him. Clara felt her breath catch. He looked up slowly when they entered, his pale blue eyes searching, trying to place her face, his lips parted slightly. "Clara," he said. She didn't answer. Grayson stepped between them. "Dad, this is Clara Monroe. She was a nurse at Memorial in 1973. You worked with her." Everett nodded slowly. "Yes, I remember." There was a silence that stretched far too long. Then Clara stepped forward. Her voice was quiet but unwavering. "You remember Marcia Bell?" The name filled the room like thunder. Everett blinked. His face twitched. And for the first time in 50 years, Clara saw something close to shame cross his expression. "I do," he whispered. Clara kept going. "She died under your knife. You missed the bleed. You froze. You tried to save yourself." She interrupted, not raising her voice, but slicing through his words like glass. "You let her die. Then you covered it up, and you let the hospital bury her. While you climbed the ladder," Everett looked down at his hands. Grayson sat across from him, jaw tight, eyes darting between his father and Clara. "She filed a report," Andre said, stepping forward. "You had it pulled." Everett didn't deny it. Why, Grayson asked. Why would you do that? Everett leaned back slowly, eyes clouded. "I was scared," he said. "I was young. I was one of the first surgeons of my class offered a seat on the review board. One mistake, one slip, and it would have all vanished. I panicked. The board gave me an out. I took it." He looked at Clara, guilt weighing every word. She wasn't supposed to die. It was supposed to be simple. Clara's hands trembled now, not from rage but from the cruel irony. She was simple to them, she said. A black nurse, replaceable, quiet. They knew no one would ask questions. Everett's eyes welled, but he said nothing. Grayson stood. "Do you know what you did to me?" he said to his father. "All my life, I've wondered why you looked at me with that hollow stare. Why nothing I did ever made you proud. It wasn't me, was it? It was you. You've been living in a mirror of your own lie." Everett closed his eyes. "I tried to forget." He said, "You don't get to forget." Clara replied. The room grew still again. Everett looked back up. "I can't undo it," he whispered, "but I have something for you." He gestured to a drawer by the window. Grayson walked over, opened it, and pulled out a thin envelope. He handed it to Clara. Her hands shook as she opened it. Inside was a letter. "Clara, I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I owe you the truth. I've kept a journal all these years. In it, I documented everything, the surgery, the decision, the silence that followed. I never published it. I never had the courage. But it's yours now. It's in my study, behind the third panel of the bookshelf. I don't expect you to understand. I only hope that in telling the truth now, you can write a different ending for her and for yourself. Everett." Clara folded the letter slowly. "I don't want your journal," she said. "I want her name cleared. I want a public statement, a real one." Everett nodded, though the motion cost him something. "I'll give it to the board," he said. "I'll make it right." "No," Clara replied. "You won't. You'll give it to Naomi Bell and the press, and if you don't, we will." Everett stared at her, and finally, he nodded again. "I understand." Grayson turned to Clara. "Do you believe he's sorry?" Clara looked down at her hands. "I believe he's afraid," she said. "But fear is where truth starts sometimes, not where it ends." They left the house quietly. Clara didn't look back. In her purse, she carried Everett's letter, but more importantly, she carried the decision to finally speak in rooms that once dismissed her. Andre opened the car door for her. "You okay?" She nodded. "No more whispers," she said. "No more waiting." She didn't say it out loud, but she felt it in her chest. The reckoning had begun. The press conference was held at the Georgia Center for Civil Accountability, just 2 blocks from the courthouse. Inside the tall glass building, reporters gathered with notepads in hand. Camera crews adjusted their tripods, and microphones branded with station logos lined the front of the podium. The air was charged not with anticipation, but something heavier, something closer to reckoning. Clara stood in the wings, behind the curtain, watching the room fill. Naomi Bell Wright was at the podium, speaking into the hum of camera lights and scribbling pens. She wore a fitted navy suit, her afro full and regal. Her voice was calm, precise, measured like a practiced surgeon, but this time the scalpel was truth. "Today," Naomi began, "we gather to speak the name that was silenced 5 decades ago, the name of a nurse who died because of a preventable surgical mistake. Her death was buried beneath bureaucracy, protected by power, and erased from medical memory. But we, her family, her colleagues, and those who have carried her story will not let her vanish again." Clara's breath hitched. Naomi continued. "Marcia Bell was 33 years old, a surgical nurse, a mother, a friend. She died in 1973 at Chicago Memorial Hospital during a routine procedure. The attending surgeon, Dr. Everett Locke, failed to respond to critical signs of internal bleeding and delayed emergency protocol. A cover-up followed. Reports disappeared. Witnesses were pressured into silence. There was a rustle in the crowd. Naomi held up a folder. "We have the original report, filed by Nurse Clara Monroe. We have taped testimony from the late James Monroe, internal documents preserved in secret, and we have a confession, signed by Dr. Locke just days ago." Flashes fired from the cameras. Reporters whispered rapidly into recorders. Eyes scanned each page of the press release handed out moments before. Naomi pressed forward. "This is not just about one death. It's about the systemic erasure of black professionals in medicine. It's about who gets to be remembered and who gets blamed. It's about silence and the cost of speaking up. A beat passed, and it's about what we do now. At that, she stepped aside, and for the first time in her life, Clara Monroe walked out into the lights. It was brighter than she expected. She stood at the podium, heart pounding like a war drum behind her ribs. Andre stood to the side, his gaze steady, a quiet anchor. Grayson was somewhere in the back, his face unreadable. Clara looked at the rows of eyes, the blinking red lights, the notepads. She took a breath. "My name is Clara Monroe," she said. "I was there when Marcia Bell died." The silence was total. I was a surgical nurse at Memorial Hospital. I worked beside her. I watched her teach, led, care, and I watched the way her life was reduced to a single sentence in a hospital memo after she died. She reached into her bag and pulled out the photo, held it up. "This is Marcia, and this," she said, voice quivering, "is me, just hours before her final shift." The image glowed across the screens behind her, projected from Naomi's presentation. I filed a report when I realized what had happened. I believed someone would listen. I believed truth would matter. She paused. It didn't. Gasps echoed softly in the corners of the room. Clara looked down, then back up. For 50 years. I stayed quiet. I told myself it was to protect my family, to avoid ruining my life. But silence becomes a wall, one that blocks not only justice, but healing. She blinked hard. "I'm not here for revenge. I'm here for truth. And I'm here so that no other nurse, no other woman of color, dies without her story being told." She stepped back. Applause didn't follow. No one moved. It wasn't that kind of moment. It was sacred. Still, unflinching. Naomi returned to the mic. "Effective today, the Bell Foundation for Medical Accountability will be launched. It will fund scholarships in Marcia's name and partner with oversight boards to create independent archives for whistleblower reports, so no voice is ever deleted again." She paused. "We also ask that Chicago Memorial publicly acknowledge the role its leadership played in suppressing this truth." Another voice shouted from the press row. "Will Dr. Locke face charges?" Naomi hesitated. "Dr. Locke is terminally ill. There are no plans for prosecution. But accountability isn't always about prison. Sometimes it's about exposure and legacy." The crowd erupted into overlapping questions, but Clara had already stepped back behind the curtain, breath shallow, eyes closed. She felt like she had just given birth to something raw, irreversible. Andre caught up to her, hand brushing her shoulder. "You did it," he said. Clara shook her head. "We did it. All of us, Marcia included." They slipped out a side door while the press frenzy grew behind them. Outside, the air felt crisper. The sky was opening up after days of rain. On the sidewalk, a group of the young medical students had gathered with signs. "Justice for Marcia. Black nurses matter. Thank you. Clara." One of them, a girl, barely in her 20s, stepped forward and hugged Clara without asking. "I want to be like you," she whispered. Clara could barely breathe. "You will be better," she said. Later that night, Clara sat in Andre's apartment, her shoes off, her legs curled under her on the couch. The TV played the press conference on repeat. Pundits debated ethics. Former board members issued statements. The internet exploded with hashtags. Photos of Marcia Bell went viral. Old nurses came out of retirement to say, "I remember her. She was the best of us. Clara held the cassette tape in her hand and finally felt its weight lift. Andre poured her tea. "Think they'll ever apologize?" he asked. Clara smiled sadly. "Maybe not out loud," she said, "but the truth has a way of haunting silence. And outside, in the city Marcia had once walked through unnoticed. Her name was now painted in chalk across sidewalks, printed on T-shirts, etched onto vigil candles. She was no longer a footnote. She was a beginning. A week after the press conference, Clara Monroe stood in front of a memorial she never thought she'd live to see. It was nestled in a garden behind the newly renamed Marcia Bell wing of the Atlanta School of Nursing. Sunlight filtered through the oaks overhead, casting gentle shadows across the walkway. A low stone wall had been built at the garden's edge, engraved with the names of nurses whose lives had been lost or overlooked during service, and there, in bold letters carved into the polished granite, it read, "Marcia, Louise Bell, 1940, 1973. She never stopped caring. Clara's breath caught when she saw it. Something inside her, something that had been coiled tight for 50 years, unraveled with painful grace. She reached out, letting her fingers trace the grooves of the letters, real, solid, permanent. The small crowd gathered behind her began to quiet as Naomi stepped forward to speak. She never got a funeral. Naomi said, not one with truth, not one where people said her name without flinching, but today we say it boldly, because one woman, Clara Monroe, refused to let the world forget. Applause followed, gentle and respectful. Clara lowered her hand and stepped back as Naomi invited her to the microphone. She didn't bring notes. She didn't need them. "I never wanted attention," Clara said, her voice even and steady. "I just wanted peace, for myself, for Marcia, for every nurse who ever kept a hospital standing on her back while others got the credit." She paused. "They told me staying quiet was safer, that it would protect my job, my family, my future, and maybe, for a time, it did. But silence isn't safety, it's surrender, and we've surrendered enough. There was a stillness in the garden. I didn't speak to be brave," she said. "I spoke because the truth finally mattered more than my fear." The moment she finished, a soft wind moved through the trees. She stepped back, unsure what to do with all the emotion running through her chest like electricity. Andre met her with a long hug, his arms wrapping around her shoulders like armor. "I'm proud of you," he said. "You should be proud of yourself," she whispered. "You helped me stand again." Grayson Locke approached next, dressed in a plain gray shirt and slacks. No designer sunglasses, no entourage, just a quiet man who had unwrapped decades of silence and pain with surprising humility. He nodded toward the memorial. She was someone, wasn't she? "She still is," Clara said softly. "I brought someone," Grayson said. "I'd like you to meet her." Clara raised an eyebrow. From behind him stepped a teenage girl, no more than 17. She had dark, curly hair pulled into a bun and wore a denim jacket covered in buttons. Her expression was cautious but curious. "This is my daughter, Lila," Grayson said. "She asked to come. She's been following everything." Clara smiled gently. "Hi, Lila." Lila stepped forward, eyes wide. "You're Clara Monroe?" "I am. You saved my dad on that flight." Clara chuckled softly. "I did what any nurse would do." "No," Lila said seriously. "You did what most people wouldn't have had the strength to do. And then you told the truth. That's not ordinary." Clara was taken aback by the certainty in her voice. "You're very wise for your age." "I've had to be," Lila said, her gaze drifting to the memorial wall. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." Lila hesitated. "Were you ever scared that telling the truth would make people hate you?" Clara took a breath. "Yes, I was terrified. Not just once, but over and over. I was afraid people would call me a liar, that they'd erase me the same way they erased her. So why did you still do it?" Clara looked at the stone again, because silence lets injustice grow roots, and eventually it becomes normal. I couldn't live with that anymore. Lila was quiet for a long time. Then she nodded. "I want to study medicine," she said. Grayson raised an eyebrow. "Since when?" "Since this," Lila replied. "Since I read Marcia's story. Since I realized how many stories get buried." Clara touched her arm. "Then make sure yours doesn't." They stood together for a while. 4 generations connected by one truth that refused to stay buried. Later. As the sun dipped low, Clara found herself sitting on a wooden bench near the garden's edge. Naomi joined her, slipping off her heels with a quiet sigh. "She would have liked this," Clara said, motioning to the garden. "She'd have loved it." Naomi replied, "The shade, the flowers, the way no one's whispering her name anymore." They were quiet for a moment. Then Naomi said, "I think we should take it national." Clara blinked. "What?" "This story. The press conference was only the beginning. But there are more Marcias, more hospitals, more locked filing cabinets. What if we build a Network A foundation that doesn't just remember one, that prevents?" Clara looked at her. "You'd lead that?" Naomi shook her head. "We both would." Clara laughed gently, then leaned back on the bench. "I'm 74 years old, Naomi, and you just changed history. You're not done. The stars were beginning to appear above them." "I don't want to fight forever," Clara said. "You won't, but you can light the way." A soft breeze passed between them. In the distance, Lila laughed as she snapped a photo of her father standing awkwardly beside the memorial stone. Andre was speaking to a group of students about aviation and nerves, and the whole garden buzzed with life. Marcia would have liked that. Not the noise or the attention, but the fact that her name finally meant something. As they stood to leave, Clara looked back one more time, and for the first time in half a century, she felt something she didn't expect. Peace. Not because the world had changed entirely, not because justice had finally arrived, but because silence no longer had the last word. 3 weeks after the memorial, the backlash began. It started small, a letter to the editor in a conservative medical journal calling the accusations against Dr. Everett Locke unnecessary character assassination. Then came whispers online from former hospital executives, questioning Clara's motives. She waited 50 years. Why now? She wants attention. She's distorting history. Clara read the comments without flinching, though they stirred something old and bitter in her chest. Naomi, on the other hand, was furious. "They're trying to rewrite the rewrite," Naomi said, pacing Clara's living room with her tablet in hand. "This is exactly what they do. They plant doubt, cast shade, muddy the water until no one can see the truth." Clara sipped her tea. "We knew this would happen. We weren't ready for how loud they'd be." The pressure mounted fast. 2 donors pulled support from the nursing scholarship fund Naomi had launched. A media outlet postponed airing their scheduled interview, and one of the largest hospitals in the Midwest publicly announced it would not be cooperating with the Bell Foundation's data audit. "They're closing ranks," Naomi muttered. Clara sat in silence for a long moment, then reached for the manila folder resting on the coffee table. Inside were a dozen letters, emails, and voicemails from nurses, interns, and even doctors across the country. People sharing their own stories of retaliation, ignored complaints, lost patients. "We're not alone," she said. Naomi glanced at the folder, then back at Clara. "But we need a bigger stage," she said quietly. "We need someone who can't be ignored." The idea was a gamble. But by the next morning, Naomi had made the call, and the man on the other end had said yes. The invitation came in the form of a cream-colored envelope with a gold-embossed seal. The Malcolm Stone Foundation for Global Dialogue. Malcolm Stone was a billionaire philanthropist, part political disruptor, part humanitarian legend. He rarely spoke publicly, but when he did, the world stopped to listen. And somehow, Naomi had convinced him to host a special roundtable broadcast, highlighting underreported voices in justice. 2 weeks later, Clara and Naomi were flown to New York City. The studio was nothing like a cable news station. It was calm, intimate walls lined with wood, soft yellow lighting. There were no shouting panels, no spinning graphics, just a long oval table, a circle of chairs, and a camera crew moving with the quiet precision of seasoned storytellers. Clara wore a navy blue dress, modest and elegant. Naomi sat beside her in a deep burgundy blazer. Across from them sat Malcolm Stone himself, tall, striking, with salt and pepper hair and the kind of piercing gaze that made you feel like he already knew your secrets. He greeted Clara first. "Ms. Monroe," he said, shaking her hand gently. "It's an honor. I'm just a nurse," she replied. Stone smiled. "Then the world needs more nurses." The broadcast began without fanfare, just a camera blinking red. "Today," Malcolm said, "we bring you a story that reshaped a life, challenged a system, and reopened a 50-year-old wound that never truly healed. Our guests are Clara Monroe and Naomi Bellwright, whose pursuit of truth has sparked a national reckoning in medicine." Naomi spoke first, laying out the legal timeline, the evidence, and the structure of their new initiative. Then Malcolm turned to Clara. "You stayed silent for decades. Why speak now?" Clara leaned forward, her voice even. "Because silence didn't save her, and it didn't save me." She told the story in plain words about Marcia's death, the cover-up, the long ache of unspoken truth, about the moment on the flight when she thought she was reviving just a man, only to realize she was waking up a legacy that had lain dormant for half a century. The room fell silent. "I didn't do this for fame. I did it because I couldn't carry it anymore." Malcolm nodded slowly. "What would you say to the people who are still afraid to come forward?" Clara's eyes misted. "I'd tell them I see you. You're not alone. And if you speak, I will stand beside you." The interview went viral before the segment even ended. Clips of Clara's voice, quiet, steady, unforgettable, flooded social media. Hashtags returned in full force. News anchors shifted their tone. Politicians reached out to Naomi requesting proposals for legislative reform. And something shifted. The very next morning, the hospital in Chicago that had refused to participate in the audit issued a public statement. "We recognize past failures and will fully cooperate with the Bell Foundation to ensure transparency and change." More hospitals followed, then medical schools, then policy groups. Clara watched it all unfold from Naomi's apartment in New York. She didn't smile much, But when Andre called her with tears in his voice, saying, "Mom, you changed the rules," she let herself breathe a little deeper. Later that evening, Malcolm Stone sent Clara a personal message. It was simple. "When you spoke, I heard my mother's voice. She was a nurse in the 60s. They erased her, too. Not anymore." 1 week later, Clara stood again in front of a crowd. This time, it was at the National Nursing Conference in Washington, D.C. She had been invited to give the closing keynote address. Thousands of nurses sat in the audience, from students to retirees. The applause that greeted her felt like a rising tide. She stepped to the mic, paused, and said, "I'm not a leader, I'm a witness." And it took me too long to understand that witnessing is a kind of power. She looked around. We are the ones who stay, who show up, who remember what others want to forget. And if enough of us speak at once, even history has to listen. The crowd stood. It wasn't just a standing ovation, it was a rising. Clara Monroe stood still in that moment, tears glistening in her eyes, feeling the echo of Marcia Bell's name in every heartbeat in the room. She had never wanted to be famous. She only ever wanted truth to have weight. And now it did. The letter arrived without ceremony, no courier, no official seal, just a plain ivory envelope in Clara Monroe's mailbox. The name, handwritten in clean cursive, Clara Monroe, Atlanta. GA, no return address, no postmark, but she knew immediately who it was from. She took it inside, set it on her kitchen table, and stared at it as sunlight filtered through the blinds. For a long time, she didn't touch it, not out of fear, but out of weight. She could feel its heaviness through the paper, like it carried the last breath of something unfinished. She waited until the house was quiet. Then she opened it. "Dear Clara, if you're reading this, then my son kept his promise and delivered this after I passed. By now, I imagine the world knows what I did. Or at least some of it, the part that mattered to you. I want to begin by saying I'm sorry. Not in the casual way men say it to relieve their conscience, but in the aching, stomach-twisting way that comes when you finally see the damage your silence caused. You were right. I froze. I made the wrong call. I watched time slip through my hands, and when I was offered a way to bury it, I took it. I buried her, and in doing so, I buried myself." Clara paused, her hands steady but her eyes clouding. "You never knew this, but I remembered you all these years. Your eyes during that surgery, the way you stepped back when I barked orders, even though I could see you knew I was wrong. I remember the report you filed. I remember how the board laughed behind closed doors and called you ambitious like it was an insult. They thought you'd go away. I prayed you wouldn't, but I did nothing to stop them. I have no excuses, only this truth. Fear is the most persuasive god men worship in power." Clara read the line again. Then, once more. She breathed slowly, folding her hands in her lap. "I wrote a journal. It's in Grayson's hands now. I told everything. Not just what happened in that operating room, but what happened after, what it cost, what it destroyed. You may never forgive me, but I hope, one day, you'll believe I finally understood. You gave Marcia what I never could. You gave her back her name, her voice. You made the world remember. You made my son remember me as something other than a mirror of failure. You are the woman I always feared and admired. You never needed permission to speak. You only needed a reason. And once you found it, you changed history. thank you. Everett Locke. Clara set the letter down. Her chest was full of something she couldn't name, not anger, not quite grief, something quieter, something like stillness. She didn't cry. Instead, she stood up, walked to the small window over her sink, and stared out at the garden where her late husband used to tend roses. She remembered Everett's voice, the way it had trembled in that room when she confronted him, the way he looked like a man begging not for redemption, but release. She understood that now. Some people ask for forgiveness because they want to be whole. Others ask because they finally see what they've broken. That evening, she sat down at her desk and wrote a note of her own. To Grayson, thank you for carrying his truth. Thank you for standing in the fire instead of watching from the shore. I received his letter, and I believe he meant it. You asked me once if I thought your father was sorry. I didn't know then, but I know now. He was, not loudly, not perfectly, but deeply, and that matters. Tell your daughter that legacy isn't built from headlines. It's built from hard conversations and soft bravery. She's already on her way. Warmly. Clara. She mailed it the next morning. The next few days were quiet. Clara returned to her routines, early walks, morning tea, phone calls with Naomi about upcoming legislation. But something inside her had shifted. For the first time in decades, she felt like her story had a spine, a through line, a place to land. And just when she thought the chapter was closed, Naomi called. They're dedicating a wing, Naomi said, at the university, in your name. Clara blinked. Mine. They say you represent everything they want to teach, not just medicine, but memory, courage, voice. Clara was quiet for a long time. I don't need a wing, she said softly. I know, Naomi replied, but we need to tell future nurses that what you did matters. Clara smiled. Then I suppose I'll have to show up. The ceremony was small but full. Students lined the halls. Professors shook her hand. A bronze plaque was unveiled beside the new simulation lab, the Clara Monroe Center for Ethical Nursing and Leadership. Clara stood beneath it, looking up at her own name, and wondered how many hours of silence it had taken to earn those engraved letters. A young student approached her after the ceremony. I just wanted to say thank you, the girl said. My mother's a nurse, and she was always afraid to speak up. Watching you gave her permission. Clara didn't know what to say at first. Then she said, tell her I was afraid, too. The girl smiled. That's why it meant so much, that night. Clara sat on her porch, wrapped in a knit shawl as stars blinked overhead. Andre called. They spoke about work, about how proud he was, about how strange it was to see her face in news segments and textbooks. Then, as the night deepened, she heard another voice, soft, in her memory. It wasn't Everett's, it was Marcia's, laughing in the break room, whispering encouragement during a tough case, clapping her hand on Clara's shoulder the night before the surgery that would change everything. You were always the brave one, Marcia had said. Clara closed her eyes. I just didn't know it yet. She whispered, and somewhere inside her, peace took root again. Not because justice had been perfect, not because every scar had healed, but because she had used her voice, and it had echoed in places she once believed would never listen. 6 months passed. The world didn't change overnight, but something had shifted. Hospitals began reevaluating whistleblower protocols. Nursing schools added a new module to their curriculum titled The Ethics of Voice, the Clara Monroe Case. Marcia Bell's name was cited in medical journals, invoked in keynote addresses, and spoken with reverence. Clara's life, though, was quieter than ever. She still woke early. She still walked the same tree-lined street, pausing at the corner bakery to smell the cinnamon rolls she never bought but always appreciated. She still kept her tea steeped strong, her books stacked near the window, and her house clean but never sterile. And sometimes, when she looked in the mirror, she no longer saw the woman who had stayed quiet for 50 years. She saw the woman who broke that silence. One Thursday morning, Naomi called with news. "We've been invited to speak at the International Medical Justice Summit." Clara smiled. "That's a mouthful." Naomi laughed. "It's in Geneva. They want you on the opening panel." Clara paused. "I haven't been on a plane since Grayson." Naomi finished gently. Clara looked out the window. Maybe it's time. 3 weeks later. Clara found herself boarding a red-eye to Switzerland. The airport felt familiar but distant. The same tired carpets, the same quiet whirl of luggage wheels, the same sense of stories suspended mid-air, waiting to land. She wore a soft blue cardigan and carried a small canvas tote. No fanfare, no press, just a woman taking another step forward. As she settled into seat 14C, she didn't realize she was sitting beside someone who recognized her. Not immediately. The man next to her was young, maybe 30, in a rumpled hoodie and noise-canceling headphones. He glanced at her, smiled politely, and went back to scrolling through his tablet. It wasn't until an hour into the flight somewhere over the Atlantic that he spoke. "Excuse me," he said, voice hesitant. "I don't mean to be weird, but are you Clara Monroe?" She blinked. "Yes." His eyes lit up. "My mom is a nurse. She made me watch your interview with Malcolm Stone twice," she said. "This woman changed the temperature of the room." Clara chuckled. "Your mom sounds very wise. She is, and you are," he said. "What you did, it changed more than medicine. It changed how people see silence." Clara looked at him. "I used to think silence protected people," she said, "but sometimes it only protects the lie." He nodded slowly. "I'm a filmmaker," he added. "I'm working on a documentary about untold stories in healthcare. Would you ever consider being interviewed?" She smiled gently. "Only if your mom gets a producer credit." He laughed out loud, and they both relaxed into the quiet hum of the cabin. The rest of the flight passed in soft conversations, shared pretzels, and a few traded glances at the in-flight map. As they landed, Clara looked out the window not to see where she was, but to remember how far she'd come. In Geneva, the summit was breathtaking. Held in a grand glass building beside Lake Geneva, it brought together doctors, ethicists, survivors, and lawmakers from over 60 countries. Clara was introduced not with a bio, but with a single sentence. She made the world remember a nurse who was supposed to be forgotten. She took the stage slowly, no notes in her hand, only her truth. "I never planned to speak into microphones," she said. "I was trained to listen, to observe, to follow protocol, but no one teaches you what to do when protocol becomes a prison." She looked across the sea of faces. Justice is not a courtroom, it's a decision. To name things, to look directly at the wound, to stop pretending it isn't bleeding. Her voice softened. Marcia Bell was not just a nurse. She was a standard, and when she was erased, so was a part of us. Tears glimmered in a few corners of the auditorium. "I'm not brave," Clara said. I'm just done being afraid." Applause rose not explosive, but reverent. The kind of applause reserved for sacred truths. That night, back in her hotel room, Clara sat by the window watching the lights reflect off the lake. She thought of James, her late husband, and what he would have said if he could see her now. "You always knew," she whispered, "long before I did." Her phone buzzed. A message from Andre. Saw the speech. Couldn't stop crying. "So proud of you. Mom, the world needed you. I needed you." She replied simply, "I needed me, too." On the flight home, Clara sat in the same seat 14C. This time, the person beside her was a young woman wearing a nursing badge clipped to her jacket. Her hair was tied back, her shoes sensible. The young nurse looked over and gasped. "You're her," she whispered. "You're the reason I didn't drop out last semester." Clara smiled. Then we made it through together. They spoke for most of the flight about patience, fears, laughter in break rooms, and the pain of being unseen. When they landed, the young nurse asked for a photo. Clara agreed. As the flash clicked, she thought of Marcia, of Everett, of Grayson, of Naomi, of Lila, of the girl who hugged her in front of the memorial, of the woman on the plane who asked nothing but gave everything. She thought of the first time she whispered the truth and how it felt like falling, and of how, in falling, she found the ground again. Weeks later, Clara returned to her quiet home. No cameras, no calls, just the wind moving through the porch screen and a fresh envelope on her doorstep. Inside was a hand-drawn portrait. It showed Clara standing at a podium holding a photo of Marcia Bell. Below it, a single sentence was written in ink because she spoke. "I will." No name, no signature. But Clara didn't need one. She placed the portrait on her mantel, and for the first time in her life, she whispered to an empty room not with grief, but with awe. She hears us now. She never wanted the spotlight. She just wanted the truth to matter. Clara Monroe didn't speak to be a hero, she spoke because silence was no longer an option. And in breaking that silence, she gave a forgotten nurse her name back, gave her son a new memory of his father, and gave an entire generation of women the courage to stand. But even now, across boardrooms and hospital corridors, injustice still echoes. So let this story remind us that racism doesn't always scream it, sometimes whispers in policy, that history is written by those who speak, not just those who survive, and that healing doesn't begin with justice, it begins with acknowledgement. If this story moved you, made you think, or reminded you of someone who deserved better, don't let it end here. Share it. Talk about it. Say her name. And if you believe that truth, no matter how long buried, deserves to rise, then we invite you to like, share, and subscribe for more stories like this. Because sometimes the quietest voices carry the loudest truths. Thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next story.